Hello and welcome to the NBDC's first YouTube video. In a very short while, we will post documentaries created and produced by the NBDC. But for now, please look at our playlist for presentations created by NBDC members and their supporters. Also, please look at our website, nativebiodata.org. The NBDC, or the Native Biodata Consortium, is an indigenous-led biobank for health and genetics equity and data sovereignty for indigenous people. Dr. Wiley Burke is a bioethicist and MD and professor emeritus at the University of Washington, Seattle. She said, "We shouldn't focus on building up trust in vulnerable populations. Rather, we should make public funders and university researchers more trustworthy." The Native Biodata Consortium is committed to this, and this is what we are helping to solve in this current big data era. It's no secret that we live in the big data era and that we have multiple technologies to collect such data. Indeed, we have heard recently that companies like Facebook, Google, and Microsoft have collected data from our internet activities, but they are also investing heavily in the biomedical industry. They are doing this because of the possibility of commercialization and profit derived from human DNA. Data is definitely the next big tribal issue, but it is also an issue for the planet. It's predicted that by 2025, the digital genome market will reach $50 billion. Here at the Native Biodata Consortium, we feel that indigenous people and tribes should be able to benefit from their own data. Here we have a graphical representation of why we want to have open data. On the right, you see all of the good reasons for having open data, which is mostly reproducibility and honesty in creating research data. There have been many attempts to create data sharing policies with minority populations and tribal populations, but without data sovereignty, tribes and these other populations will not have the empowerment and protection to benefit from their own data. Tribes need to work on building capacity and capability. They need to fortify their laws and policies, and they need to create immediate ways to leverage this data for economic growth. And they cannot do this without the proper technology and infrastructure to do these things. Many historical movements and subsequent laws protect tribal self-determination and governance. However, up until recently, tribes have had not the means to collect or control their own data. In this graph on the right, you see the normal types of data that tribes concern themselves with and have the ability to control within their borders. However, many entities outside the tribe and government agencies collect data on the tribe's behalf. Things such as business data, external government data that is supposed to interact and improve tribal governance, and many types of research data, which is supposed to improve the quality of life in tribal communities. This data is often not shared freely with tribal governments and is certainly not controlled by tribal governments. Furthermore, since the 1980s, several laws have been created to control the access and use of data collected with public tax dollars. This is especially concerning since a lot of tribal data is collected in this way. Here, the Bayh-Dole Act attempts to delineate and define stakeholders that can develop and create intellectual property from such data. As you can see in the bottom, it says that universities would have to agree to set up due diligence requirements to identify other stakeholders that might have a stake in such intellectual property. To our knowledge, so far this has not been done with tribal governments. Although they might be successful for the U.S. economy, such laws, it could be argued, erode academic integrity and the public charge to use public tax dollars to collect data and create technologies for the public good. Federal Law H.R. 2272, otherwise known as the America Competes Act, was initialized in 2007 and amended heavily through 2015. It was created to give the U.S. a competitive edge on the world stage in science, technology, and education. However, it seems that tribal governments were left out, and certainly tribal governments are not taking part in the intellectual property windfall that such laws have created. Another legislative change that has happened worldwide is that several Western countries have changed their patent law from first to develop to first to file. This definitely corresponds to our ability to digitize information and turn it into intellectual property rapidly, over and above the ability for underrepresented populations to do the same or compete in this market. There have been some attempts to protect third world countries and indigenous peoples from such legislation. The Nagoya Protocol is one of them. The Nagoya Protocol protects genomic resources and traditional knowledges for such groups and guarantees access and benefit sharing on any intellectual property that might develop from their own data. However, it only protects non-human data. It does not protect data collected before the Nagoya Protocol took effect, and right now Canada and the United States have not ratified the Nagoya Protocol. The Nagoya Protocol is attacked for a variety of reasons, and it's currently being attacked as an impediment to COVID response worldwide. The Native Biodata Consortium came into existence through a grant written by Jennifer Lee Puk-Tan at the Mike Snyder Lab at Stanford. The grant was titled Biorepository for American Indian Capacity Education, Law, Economy, and Technology, or BRACELET. It came into being with the idea of creating a lab for Indigenous peoples, a data repository for Indigenous peoples, and a resource for Indigenous peoples as an act of self-determination and self-sustainability. Early in 2018, the Native Biodata Consortium received its tax ID from the Internal Revenue Service. Later that same year, it achieved nonprofit status through the IRS's approval of its 501c3 application. In May of 2019, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe approved and recognized the Native Biodata Consortium. We thank them for their recognition, and we recognize that they've set precedents all over Indian country for many years prior. Due to the previous examples of a lack of forethought, lack of tribal consultation, and subsequent negligence of many issues, we feel that the Native Biodata Consortium's creation was inevitable. Many U.S. tribes do not participate in research because of historic mistrust, stories of research abuse, policies that do not favor tribal control, and a demonstrable lack of evidence for health and healthcare improvements in tribal communities. We feel that tribes can utilize their tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction and the interest in their samples and data to leverage solutions towards better health and healthcare. We also feel that such entities as the NBDC can improve data sovereignty and data governance, or create for the first time in certain tribes a data sovereignty and data governance field. In short, entities like the Native Biodata Consortium can help create better respect of sovereignty by insisting on strong tribal oversight, help create jobs and educational opportunities in high tech, promote good health and state-of-the-art healthcare through science, and ensure that science and research is done with us, for us, and by us. Here we invite you to visit our website, nativebio.org, where you will learn about our research, our endeavors in STEM education, our facilities, and the composition of our executive board. Feel free to go to our website to look at these pages in more detail, but briefly, our executive board consists of 12 members representing 9 indigenous nations across the world. They come from several different disciplines and are housed at different universities and are experts in their fields. They help us to make decisions on how to go forward and best serve Indigenous people. The Native Biodata Consortium is located in north central South Dakota, in the center or the heart of the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation. In addition to supporting tribal sovereignty, data, and resource management, the NBDC is trying to merge three goals of the big data era. Number one is precision health and precision genomics used in an accurate manner. Number two is community input that would drive sovereignty and policy and sustainability, and creating proper tools for community engagement, locally informed ethics, deliberative engagement, tribal regulation, and STEM education that would give tribes control and capacity to ensure the first two. We do this because we recognize that there is something called Indigenous Genomic Data Sovereignty, which is supported by the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and because we recognize that data, especially genomic data, is going to be a large part of our future economy. Next, we're going to tell you a little bit about why we're doing this and some of the projects that we've begun to get to these goals. As you may know, Native Americans suffer some of the worst health disparities in the United States across many different health outcomes. This is just a small example of them. As stated earlier, non-white populations haven't participated much in the research, and that was true before the present genomic and big data era, and much hasn't changed since the genomic era started. As you can see from this graph, in 2009, most of the publicly available DNA genome references are of European ancestry, and it didn't much change by 2016, where any increase of non-white genomes in these databases have mostly been East Asian, somewhat South Asian, and a little bit African, but hardly any North American or South American indigenous populations have contributed to this increase. One of the timely projects for the Native Biodata Consortium is COVID-19 and public health surveillance. There are a lot of questions about testing and vaccine validation in Native American populations that is not being conducted in any kind of tailored or compartmentalized manner, and we'd like to contribute to that work. Also, there is quite a bit of data missing in terms of pre-existing health conditions. As we mentioned earlier, there might be an abundance of health outcomes that already exist in these populations that make them more susceptible to COVID infection, COVID ICU visits, and possibly COVID deaths. We also want to collect data post-COVID in terms of worsening those pre-existing conditions or creating new conditions that we haven't seen yet, and we want to be able to monitor and surveil those as they arise. Additionally, one of the downfalls of tribal spaces is that they don't have a lot of professional expertise or corroborated or vetted testing information, so we want to be able to create for the first time a CLIA certified lab in the local area that tribes can use to ensure that what they say is happening on the ground will be taken seriously by departments and agencies up the ladder. One of the projects that was actually the foundation for the Native Biodata Consortium was an investigation into Native American autoimmune disease. There are particular incidences and prevalences of certain autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and scleroderma that are much higher in Native American populations than they are in white or black populations in the United States. And this work actually started in 2009, and we're going to continue it into the future to get closer and closer to therapeutic solutions for the unique presentation of autoimmune disease in Native American populations. One of the much overlooked areas in this genomic and big data era is creating mid-level and basic level people on the ground in Native communities that can explain some of these new technologies and the diagnostics that come from those technologies in a tailored fashion for Native American communities. Genetic counseling and medical education in general is tailored towards the majority, and we need to start moving with these technologies and the resolution that they give us to an equal resolution in genetic counseling. One of the bigger goals for indigenous people, not just here in the United States, but globally, is seeking out samples that have been collected from them in the past, within the last 75 years, and possibly repatriating them to their homelands, either for further use or temporary storage until a tribal government can decide what should be done with them, whether or not they be stored, reburied, or disposed of in some traditional manner, or used for continued use either within their homelands or at a trusted university or research partner. But we at the NBDC hope to be a safe harbor, as it were, for not only the tribes here in the Dakotas, but elsewhere as well. And of course, the Native Biodata Consortium feels like one of the largest places we can excel is creating policies, law, and governance structures based on local ethics rather than ethics that have been created elsewhere and applied sometimes blindly or inappropriately to Native communities. So we believe that these ethical considerations and scholarly deliberations will definitely help Native people in this big data era. But as has been pointed out several times, these considerations in Native communities often have parallels and can inform the decisions for communities out in the greater world. Currently, in the open access data environment we find ourselves in, a set of principles called FAIR, which delineates findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data sets, is being applied to be accountable to the public charge of research because it uses public tax dollars, that all of the data should be accessible and usable by as many people as possible towards the goal of finding solutions quickly and for as many people as possible to improve or save their lives. However, we feel that the world is not quite ready for FAIR principles because there's still a lot of inequities, especially in terms of manufacture and healthcare delivery systems, that we want to also include things that represent tribal principles, and some of them are called the CARE principles, which means collective benefit to tribal groups, authority to control by tribal groups, the understanding and responsibility of outside researchers to tribal groups, and then, as I said earlier, ethics that are tailored to tribal communities, so that their spiritual and cultural and um, economic protections are in place. Our cousins in Canada have gotten a little bit further with these principles and created something called OCAP, which is another level of control that we here at the Native Biodata Consortium will seek out and try and attain by following their example. And we feel that this is definitely necessary in an environment where things are moving very quickly and the rules are being applied in a somewhat unregulated and loose manner. So we would want to go the extra step to take more protective actions if possible. In addition to repatriating biomedical samples that have been collected over the last 75 to 50 years, there's also an additional area of concern which has somewhat to do with biomedicine, but really has to do with a historic injustice of collecting ancient DNA, skeletons, cultural artifacts, mounds, clothing, lots of things that have been collected for museums, trying to get that back as well. As I said, not only because it would, in some regard, inform some of our biomedical questions, but also because these are samples that have been taken in the past without consent, just recently controlled by NAGPRA, but generally are seen as unregulated by the tribes because they already exist in museum collections, and we feel that as much as possible tribes should endeavor to get those back and then at least temporarily house them with a place like us to see if any meaningful data can be derived, and if the tribes decide not to do any of those types of investigations, at least they have safe harbor and the time to make those decisions on a considered basis rather than a panicked or hurried basis. In our short existence, the NBDC has done quite a bit. The next material will demonstrate that. Here you'll find 8 publications that we've co-authored with other scientists and academics regarding many issues around tribal data, tribal samples, and tribal ancient remains. One of the publications to note is this idea of creating something called polygenic risk scores for the clinic, which some people think work well, other people think there's too much data missing to make those polygenic risk scores reliable. And the publication number 5 here actually talks a little bit about that, and there's not enough data for non-white populations to make those predictions very relevant to non-white populations. Additionally, there's been a lot of pushback about community and tribal control over data and samples, that in order to move quicker, faster, and better, that more open access should be considered because we spent so much money since 2003 on all of this genomic data, and it's not produced a lot of benefit for people nationally. And so the papers 6, 7, and 8 kind of criticize that pushback in terms of their reasons for why genomic investigations have not helped people and have not helped Native people especially. The Native Biodata Consortium helped create one of the first Twitter conferences called Decolonize DNA Day, where people of color and people of underrepresented backgrounds gave their professional opinions on how DNA is being used or misused in the current era, and that was a great success. Also, representatives from Native Biodata Consortium went to Manchester, England to participate in something called Double Helix History, which talked about genealogy and genetic uses to identify past ancestry histories of different people, and how that's used not only in history and anthropology, but in biomedicine. And we've done a lot of advocacy and consultation to other groups around the country in terms of how to do this work in a better way. As was said earlier about doing work in the ethics, policy, and law space, we have endeavored to do more qualitative research in a intertribal fashion with a group out of the University of Oklahoma called CIGR, the Center on the Ethics of Indigenous and Genomic Research, which has representatives from many tribes and many academic disciplines talking about what kind of information do tribes need to consider before they decide to go forward with genetic research, and then what kind of information do they need to govern it once they've decided to go forward. And we've done similar work with Stanford through Sphere, through a more traditional method using focus groups. Since COVID started, the Native Biodata Consortium has been helping tribal groups in many ways, but the greatest way is through our ability to be a headquarters and hub for collecting donations for things like personal protective equipment during at the beginning and during the COVID pandemic. Probably one of the happiest and most beneficial ways that we've been able to work is with Project HELP, which is here on Cheyenne River, and through the Northwest Earth and Space Science Pipeline Program in Washington State to bring STEM education to local kids in the summer. We've done this 2 years in a row. We got stopped with the pandemic for 2 years, but we are looking at and likely to get more funding to make a generalized STEAM camp, not just NASA STEAM, but other science disciplines as well, and include as many kids, whether they're science inclined or not, to participate in a healthy way with science. And then just this year, even with COVID raging, we had a virtual session of data training. And so this is data more generally, so not just biomedical or genomic data, but any data that might fall under a tribal or indigenous purview. And it was a week-long course that we held on Zoom. We had several different instructors over several different disciplines talk to students at undergraduate and graduate levels about the ethical and cultural, spiritual, and scientific considerations that tribes and tribal researchers should have over data. So data could be beehives, it could be agriculture, it could be business and voting data, it could be language data, it could be plant or wildlife or human data. We covered the gamut, and it was a great success, and it was one of our first forays into higher education training. This is just briefly some of the partnerships that we've gained over the last couple of years. As we've said, Stanford, as we've said, the University of Oklahoma, the Center of Ethics and Indigenous Genomic Research, the Matt Anderson Lab at Ohio State, Illumina Technologies. We have a partnership with the MacArthur Foundation and the Doris Duke Foundation. And this next group of partners, we consider initial collaborative work that we hope grows into more robust partnerships, but we are working with the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, Tribal Ventures here on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, Big Fire Law, it's the first all-indigenous, all-female-led law firm in the United States based in Omaha. We've had a long-term collaboration with a summer internship for Indigenous people in genomics, which is international now, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And then the Indigenous Futures Lab with Dr. Kaolu Fox at UC San Diego. And then we've been co-applicants on 4 machine learning and artificial intelligence grants here in the last few months with Queen's Toronto, Stanford University, and Arizona State. So in conclusion, the Native Biodata Consortium's goals are to increase awareness over genomics in the big data era, expand our assistance to tribes on the Northern Plains, including the Southern Plains of Canada, expand our network and increase the mutual benefit to our collaborators, and then make data immediately impactful for Indigenous people, meaning that we would use protection to leverage more empowerment and increase the capacity or the ability for data to benefit tribal and Indigenous groups. And with that, that is the end of our presentation, and I thank you, and I hope you look into our webpage and seek us out more for any questions or concerns that you might have. Thank you very much.